The only people that I know who aren't are people who are unhappy in life and been a big disappointment to them.
There are some stories that Hollywood never quite figures out how to tell. Not because the facts are missing, but because the silence surrounding them is so complete, so deliberate, that breaking through it feels almost wrong. The story of Dan Blocker and his wife Dolphia Parker Blocker is exactly that kind of story. It is not a tale of scandal or disgrace. It is not a story of addiction or excess, the way so many Hollywood tragedies tend to be. It is something quieter, and in many ways, far more devastating. It is the story of a man who was larger than life in every possible sense of the word, who built something beautiful with his family, who was right in the middle of living the life he had chosen, and who was taken without warning, without ceremony, and without any of the dramatic build-up that the world tends to expect before it loses someone great. Dan Blocker was not supposed to die young. That is the part that never stops feeling wrong. He was not reckless. He was not self-destructive. He did not drink himself into ruin, or push his body past every limit the way some men of his era did. He was a Korean War veteran, a former teacher, a devoted father of four, a man who had earned a master's degree in dramatic arts and had once been well on his way to a doctorate. He was Hoss Cartwright to millions of Americans, the gentle giant at the heart of one of the most beloved television programs in history. He was a man in his early 40s with what should have been decades ahead of him. And then, in the spring of 1972, everything stopped. To understand how jarring his death was, you have to understand how full his life had become in the years just before it. By the early 1970s, Dan Blocker had achieved something genuinely rare among major television stars of his time. He had managed to separate himself, at least partially, from the machine of celebrity. While other actors of his stature were collecting mansions and chasing tabloid coverage, Blocker had quietly relocated his family to Lugano, Switzerland. The decision had nothing to do with money or tax sheltering, as rumors at the time suggested. If anything, living overseas cost him more. What Switzerland gave him was something no amount of money could buy inside the borders of Hollywood. Anonymity. Peace. The ability to walk down a street and simply be a man, not an icon. In Lugano, Bonanza aired only in German, and in the Italian-speaking southern region of Switzerland where the Blockers had settled, very few people watched the show at all. That meant Dan Blocker could sit in a cafe, take his children to school, and move through his days without being grabbed, photographed, or recognized. For a man who had always been deeply uncomfortable with the physical intrusion of fame, this was not a luxury. It was a necessity. He had spent years on the set of Bonanza being adored from a distance, and then years off it being crowded by strangers who felt entitled to his presence simply because they had watched him on their television screens every Sunday night. Switzerland was his exhale. He had also found a genuine rhythm with his family during those years. His wife, Dolphia Parker Blocker, whom he had married back in 1952, had been with him through every phase of his life. She had known him before Hoss Cartwright existed. She had watched him teach school in Texas and New Mexico. She had raised their 4 children alongside him, twin daughters Deborah Lee and Dana Lynn, and sons David and Dirk, while he commuted between Lugano and the Bonanza soundstages in California. Their marriage was not the kind that made headlines, and that was precisely the point. It was steady, private, and built on something that had nothing to do with fame. In early 1972, Dan Blocker returned to the United States to begin filming what would turn out to be the 14th season of Bonanza. Those who saw him during this period noticed something different about him. The energy that had always made him fill up a room, that enormous, warm, slightly overwhelming presence, seemed diminished. He looked tired in a way that sleep could not explain. He complained of weakness. The man who had once set his own broken collarbone on a film set and climbed back onto a horse to finish a scene was now struggling through ordinary days in a way that concerned the people around him. He went to see his doctors. The diagnosis that came back was serious. Blocker was suffering from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had traveled to his lungs. This was not a condition that could be managed with rest and aspirin. It was life-threatening, and it required surgery. The procedure was scheduled, and those close to him understood the gravity of the situation, but there was also a reasonable amount of hope. Blocker was in his early 40s. He was, despite everything, a physically powerful man. Surgery carries risk, but it also carries the possibility of recovery, and everyone who loved him was holding on to that possibility. The surgery took place on May 13, 1972, at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles. Dan Blocker did not survive it. He died on the operating table from complications related to the procedure. He was 43 years old. The news spread through Hollywood and across the country with the kind of speed that accompanies only the most unexpected losses. There was no period of illness that the public had been prepared for. There had been no slow farewell, no deathbed interviews, no final episode filmed with a knowing sadness. He was simply there, and then he was not. Millions of Americans who had grown up watching Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza learned in an ordinary news bulletin that the man behind the character was gone. Not retired. Not stepping away from the show. Gone. For the cast and crew of Bonanza, the loss was not abstract. Lorne Greene, who played patriarch Ben Cartwright, and Michael Landon, who played Little Joe, had spent more waking hours with Dan Blocker over the previous 14 years than most people spend with their closest friends. They had filmed together 5 days a week, often from early morning until late at night. Landon had served as best man at one of the most important celebrations in Blocker's personal life. Greene had been a constant professional partner and a genuine friend. The grief that hit the set of Bonanza was not the grief of colleagues losing a coworker. It was the grief of a family losing one of its own. There was also the immediate question of what would happen to the show. Bonanza had already been struggling in the ratings during its 13th season, having lost some of its earlier dominance as television tastes shifted and new programs competed for the same Sunday night audience. The producers and network faced an impossible decision. How do you continue a show built around a family when one of its most beloved members has suddenly and permanently disappeared? The answer, ultimately, was that you cannot. Not really. Bonanza limped through a 14th season without Hoss, with writers constructing awkward explanations for his absence, and the show was cancelled in January 1973. The series that had once been one of the most watched programs in American television history ended not with a triumphant finale but with a quiet fade, its heart having been torn out months before the cameras finally stopped rolling. But this story does not end with Dan Blocker alone. Because the woman he had loved and lived beside for 20 years, the woman who had chosen to build a quiet life with him in Switzerland rather than perform the role of Hollywood wife, now found herself facing something that no amount of privacy could shield her from. Dolphia Parker Blocker was a widow at a time when the entire world knew her husband's face. The way Dolphia handled the years after Dan's death is one of the most striking and least discussed aspects of this whole story. She did not write a memoir. She did not appear on talk shows to discuss her grief. She did not sell her story to a magazine or allow herself to be packaged as a sympathetic figure for public consumption. She did not lean into the identity of Dan Blocker's widow the way the entertainment industry would have welcomed and encouraged. Instead, she disappeared. Not into scandal or crisis, but into the simple, determined privacy that she and Dan had always valued together. This choice, quiet as it was, carried an enormous kind of dignity. Hollywood has always had a complicated relationship with the women left behind by famous men. Some are expected to grieve publicly and permanently, to become monuments to their husband's legacy, to appear at anniversary screenings and tribute events and allow their ongoing sadness to serve as proof of how much the lost man was loved. Others are criticized for moving forward too quickly, for remarrying, for smiling too soon. Dolphia refused both traps. She simply stepped back from a public life that had never truly been hers to begin with, and got on with the business of raising her children and living. The financial reality she faced in the immediate aftermath of Dan's death was not as secure as many people assumed. While Blocker had been one of the highest-paid actors on television during Bonanza's peak years, the move to Switzerland had come with real costs, and the nature of television contracts in the 1960s and early 1970s meant that residual income from reruns was structured very differently than it would be today. There were 4 children to support, a life that had been built around a man's income and career, and suddenly, without warning, that foundation was gone. Dolphia managed. She had always been, by every account from those who knew the family, a grounded and capable woman. The same qualities that had made her comfortable with the unconventional choice to move her children to Switzerland, to enroll them in foreign schools and encourage them to learn new languages and think of Europe as their extended backyard, served her well in the years that followed. She was not a woman who needed the world to validate her choices. She knew what mattered, and she held onto it. Her children grew up. Deborah Lee and Dana Lynn, the twin daughters, carved out their own lives. David and Dirk, the sons who had once raced their father to the electric racetrack in the family home in Northridge, became adults who carried their father's memory in the private way that children of grief learn to carry things. The Blocker family did not become a public institution of mourning. They became, quietly and on their own terms, survivors. There is something important to say about what Dan Blocker's death meant for the people who had watched him every week without ever meeting him. The relationship between a television audience and a beloved character is a strange and underappreciated kind of bond. Hoss Cartwright had been a Sunday night constant for millions of American families for more than a decade. Children had grown up watching him. Parents had come to rely on him as a fixture, a dependable presence in the rhythm of the week. When Dan Blocker died, those people did not just lose an actor. They lost something that had been quietly woven into the fabric of their ordinary lives. This is not a small thing. It is easy to be cynical about the grief that ordinary people feel when public figures die, to dismiss it as parasocial delusion or misplaced emotion. But the truth is that the characters people love on television, especially characters played with the kind of warmth and authenticity that Dan Blocker brought to Hoss Cartwright, become genuinely meaningful in people's lives. They are companions during lonely evenings. They are the subject of conversations between parents and children. They are, in some real sense, part of the texture of a life. When they disappear without warning, the loss is real even if it is difficult to articulate. What made Blocker's death particularly hard for audiences to process was the fact that there was no goodbye. Hoss Cartwright simply vanished from the screen. The 14th season of Bonanza addressed his absence with a brief and clumsy explanation, and then the show itself ended. There was no final episode for Hoss, no last ride across the Ponderosa, no moment that allowed the audience to properly close the chapter. The character just stopped existing, and that absence, that abrupt silence where a beloved presence had been, lingered for a long time. In the decades since his death, Dan Blocker has never quite received the kind of sustained cultural attention that his talent and his story deserve. He is remembered, certainly, and affectionately, but he tends to be remembered as a piece of television nostalgia rather than as the genuinely complex and interesting man he was. The veteran who came back from Korea with a deep and permanent hatred of firearms. The man with a master's degree in theater who played someone the world assumed was slow and simple. The political progressive who supported Eugene McCarthy while his character embodied a vision of frontier America that was anything but progressive. The devoted father who moved his family to Switzerland not to avoid taxes but to avoid being famous. These contradictions are not flaws. They are the most interesting thing about him. Dan Blocker was a man who contained multitudes, who had managed to build a life that was genuinely his own despite the enormous gravitational pull of celebrity, and who had found, in a quiet corner of southern Switzerland, something close to the peace he had always been looking for. He was in the middle of that life when it ended. He was 43 years old and he had decades of it still ahead of him, and then suddenly he did not. Dolphia Parker Blocker outlived her husband by many years. She lived long enough to see Bonanza become a permanent piece of television history, long enough to watch her children build their own lives, long enough to know that the man she had married and moved to Switzerland with and grieved in private had not been forgotten by the world, even if she herself had chosen to step away from it. She remained, to the end, the woman she had always been. Private. Dignified. Unwilling to let her identity be consumed by someone else's fame, even someone she had loved completely. She died in 2004, more than 30 years after Dan. In those 3 decades, she had given the public almost nothing to work with. No interviews. No revelations. No carefully managed appearances designed to keep her husband's brand relevant. She had simply lived, and in doing so she had honored, in the most complete way possible, everything that Dan Blocker had always stood for. The belief that a real life, lived quietly and on your own terms, is worth more than any amount of public attention. There is a particular cruelty to the timing of Dan Blocker's death that tends to get lost in the broader sadness of the story. He had spent years fighting against the pull of celebrity, trying to hold onto something normal while one of the most famous television shows in history demanded more and more of his time and energy. He had found a solution, an imperfect one, but a real one, in Lugano. He had a plan for how to continue being Hoss Cartwright on screen while remaining Dan Blocker at home. He was not burned out. He was not defeated. He was, by every account, genuinely content with the balance he had struck. And then it was gone. Not because he made a wrong decision or took a foolish risk, but because his body failed him in the most ordinary and devastating way that bodies sometimes do. A blood clot. A surgical complication. The kind of thing that does not care how large a man is, how brave he has been, how much he is loved, or how many more years he deserved to have. What remains, beyond the grief, is something worth holding on to. A man who played a fictional character of extraordinary decency and managed, without fanfare, to live his own life by roughly the same code. A man who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier, who chose privacy when attention was freely available, who chose Switzerland and mountain air and anonymous cafe mornings over marble statues and gated estates and the hollow glamour of a Hollywood he never wanted. Dan Blocker was not just Hoss Cartwright. He was something better, something more complicated and more human. And Dolphia Parker Blocker, the woman who stood beside him and then stood alone and then stood tall for 30 more years without asking anyone to notice, deserves to be remembered as something more than a footnote in his story. She was a woman of extraordinary quiet strength, and in a world that tends to reward noise, that kind of strength is rarer than it looks. The awful ending of their story is real, and it should be acknowledged. But the life that came before it, and the dignity that came after it, is what endures.